am Lil.
And I'm Fitz.
And you're listening to Knock Once for Yes. How are you, lovely listeners? I hope this year is treating you well so far. It feels like it's been a really long winter, but we're finally starting to see some sunnier days, and we've been busy planning loads of spooky road trips for the year ahead. Although our first one didn't quite go according to plan. More on that later, but first, Fitz, what have we got coming up on today's episode?
This episode, we dive beneath the waves for our paranormal bucket list, or perhaps this time we might name it the Paranormal Sonar, as we share a spooky location we'd love to visit. We have listener stories from Kate, Nancy and Kat, and we get a bit deep as we dive into the fascinating world of infrasound and the paranormal, and discover that things are rather more complicated than they may first appear.
And as we know, some of you guys like to get stuck right into the main segment. If you want to jump ahead to any of those specific bits, there are timestamps in the show notes for you. But before we get stuck into all of that, we want to say a huge thank you to our latest patrons.
Ichabod Cranium and Kim Jones.
And a massive thank you to an anonymous supporter on our Ko-fi platform. As always, thank you to all of our patrons and Ko-fi supporters, old and new. I really don't know how we got so lucky, but we genuinely do have the most amazing supporters in the world. Not only could we not do the show without you, but over the last few years, which haven't been easy for anybody, you've all been a source of strength and hope and inspiration, and we really can never thank you enough for all that you do. And I know I said it last time and we're rubbish, but I promise, patrons, we do have some videos coming for you. I promise, really soon.
So, first up sees the return of the paranormal bucket list after we spotted that a Titanic exhibition was coming to town.
Now, I don't know about you guys, but I think that many of us with an interest in the spooky and paranormal can't shake a certain fascination with the tragic tale of the Titanic. And it's not really surprising considering that supernatural tales seem to have surrounded the doomed ship even before its fateful journey, and have continued right up to the present day. No less than 2 authors wrote what would essentially become premonitions of the disaster, or elements of it, in the form of fictional stories years before the fateful voyage. And one of those writers, journalist W.T. Stead, actually boarded and went down with the Titanic. Not content with just predicting the calamity that claimed his life, however, mediums of the era's popular spiritualist movement claim to have been contacted by that very same author and journalist from beyond his watery grave. Many of the wives of the sailors and crew of the Titanic living in Southampton reported nightmares and hearing their names called on the night that the Titanic sank, long before the news broke around the world, including Captain Smith's wife, who saw a crisis apparition of her husband. Ships passing by the wreck of the site of the Titanic have reported picking up strange interference on their radios and even receiving SOS signals that no one has ever been able to find a source for. Phantoms of the ship's crew have been spotted in various locations, sometimes in places you would expect, such as Captain Smith's childhood home, but also in many places where the crew may never have been, but in which collections of artefacts from the doomed ship have been collected. Exhibits of artefacts in Los Angeles, Orlando, even a Belfast pub housing an extensive collections of items from the ship, all seem to have attracted paranormal activity, with apparitions of crew and passengers being spotted, and staff reporting the eerie sounds of disembodied footsteps, and even an orchestra playing after hours when the buildings are empty and quiet. A few years ago, we reported on a mirror that had once belonged to Captain Smith that had gone up for auction. The former owner of the mirror had described in letters how Captain Smith's face would appear in the mirror on the anniversary of the Titanic's sinking. So it would seem that anywhere Titanic artefacts gather, there may be the possibility for spooky activity. And it just so happens that there is a collection of artefacts touring the UK this year, with exhibitions at Birmingham and Manchester this summer. It seems that White Star Heritage, whose website states that they are Titanic exhibition and museum experts, have been taking their Titanic exhibition around the country for a few years now, but this was the first time I'd heard about it. And whilst I haven't heard any ghost stories specifically from the exhibition's most recent venues, I have to wonder what it's like shutting up those exhibition spaces full of artefacts late at night when everybody else has gone home. I've been fascinated by the story of the Titanic since we had to study it for our GCSE English coursework. Now, I'm a bit old, so this was quite a while before the Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio movie came out, so research involved poring over books and old newspaper articles. But the particular eeriness of that story never really left me, and I've kind of wanted to visit a Titanic museum or exhibition for a while. I sometimes worry that it's a bit ghoulish, which isn't me at all normally, but I just can't explain exactly why the story of the Titanic seems to worm under my skin and hold me in such rapt fascination. So it has been kind of a bucket list item for me for some time, and I must admit that seeing that there is going to be an exhibition not far from us at all did tempt me. White Star Heritage are putting on exhibitions at Birmingham NEC and Manchester Exchange Hall in this summer, around the end of July to the end of August, and then in October they'll be at Glasgow Box Hub Warehouse. Now the NEC is not that far from us and we've been a few times before. It's great, it's easy to get to, there's loads of parking and a shuttle bus, but it's also jam-packed with people. It's really busy venue, and you guys know that we're not peoply jam-packed crowds kind of people. So this item may be remaining on my bucket list for a little bit longer. But it looks like the exhibition will be touring it in years to come, so maybe we'll catch it in the future, or maybe we'll visit one of the museums on a quieter day in Belfast or Southampton, or maybe even abroad. And annoyingly, we could have done years ago, because I found out while I was researching this news article that there is a museum exhibition in Orlando on International Drive where we were staying quite a few years ago now. So I was quite frustrated when I saw that, because we could have gone and seen one and I'm sure it would have been amazing. We were right there and I just had no idea it existed.
You're possibly going to hate me for this, but I think I remember seeing that it was there, but I didn't realise you were so interested and didn't mention it.
Fits.
I think there's like a Titanic experience building on
International Drive, I think so.
I saw it. I think we drove past it a few times.
We probably did, but to be fair, that trip, we had an absolutely jam-packed schedule. And I'm not sure, even if we'd known it was there, I don't know there would have been a day we could have fitted it in. We had everything.
Knowing what we know now, we could have done. Because we had one day where the travel was a lot shorter than we expected, and we could have just skipped that and gone. But
we didn't realise how, I was going to say easy driving is in America. Easy is not the right word. Less roundabouty.
And you guys do not know how meticulously we plan.
We really do. We've still got we have a folder.
Yeah.
We've still got the folder.
We had a holiday folder with like every place we were going, all the printouts of the sat-nav directions and the instructions for getting to places and times.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. We
were super organised.
Oh, God, we're really sad, aren't we?
I'd do it all again. Well, if any of you guys do decide to visit one of the White Star Heritage exhibitions, we would love to know how it goes. Please do get in touch and let us know what your visit was like.
And do let us know if you visit one of the museums abroad as well, unless it's the one on International Drive, in which case we're either going to pretend that it doesn't exist or that it was terrible and we didn't miss anything.
Don't listen to him. We'd love to hear about that one as well. Of course we would. Well, I think it's story time. And this first story is from Kate.
When I saw these, what shall I call them, dark images, I hadn't been aware of the term shadow figures, despite me always having had an interest in the paranormal. Nor had I come across the term blacker than black, but they were all of the above. I'm originally from England, but have been living in Canada since 2011. My husband and boys have spent 3 years previous to that living in the US. We always love our vacations there. It feels like another home. And living in Alberta, Canada, it takes a while for summer to get going. So, like many, we head south of the border to soak up some of the sun's warm rays and break up our long winters. Spring of 2016 was no different. We'd booked a Verbo at La Quinta, close to Palm Springs. The US Open at Indian Wells had just finished, and Coachella had yet to happen. The weather was typical California sun, hot days of 30 degrees C, cooler nights, perfect to cool down the surrounding desert. The small Verbo house was situated in a modern residential area at the end of a cul-de-sac and backing onto one of the many golf courses that surround the area. The owners had spent time and money making this a comfortable, clean property to stay in. In the garden was a little pool. It all looked lovely. It even felt comfortable. But something was off with the master bedroom. It felt heavy. I put that down to the fact that it was decorated with a big, heavy 4-poster bed. There was not much natural light, and what windows there were faced east, and they were hidden from sunrise by the tall garden wall. That room felt heavy and still. But I was a mum of 2 young boys, 10 and 8 years old, and this was a holiday. I was pretty determined to push those odd feelings aside and enjoy hot sunshine and being able to be outside without multiple layers of clothing. I should say that, although looking back, I definitely link the heaviness of the room to my experience, the shadow figures appeared just once while I was there. But that room, I didn't want to spend much or any time longer than I had to in it throughout my stay. I'd gone to bed, tired, happy and relaxed, having put my boys in their bedrooms. There was nothing particularly remarkable about the day. The boys had run out of steam having played in the pool at the end of the day. Normal holiday stuff. I read, took off my glasses and turned off the light. The room was dark. Well, no shocks there. It was night, and as I said before, there was not much natural light in that room. At some point later, though, unsure of the time, I woke. It was one of those nudging feelings you get as a parent awake. I leaned up on my left elbow and saw what I initially thought were both my boys standing next to the bed. As I reached for my glasses, though, and asked what they needed, I felt a deep sinking feeling. The room was dark, but they were darker. I hadn't even thought of this before hearing accounts on other podcasts about shadow figures being blacker than black. Like all light had been sucked out. A blackness that seemed thick. The height of these figures was about the same as my 2 boys, which is why I had thought it was them. A taller figure closest to me, then a middle figure, then a third. Oh, wait. I don't have 3 children. My heart was beginning to pound. Then I realised if they were my boys, they probably wouldn't be standing at least an arm's length away from me. They'd be much closer. But these shadows were standing in line of descending height. Although I'd reached for my glasses, I hadn't put them on. So I shuffled to put them on, looked up, and nothing. They were gone. I just sat in bed for a few minutes wondering what on earth had just happened. I then got up to make sure my boys were indeed in their rooms. They were, sound asleep. No way in the split second that it took to put my glasses on that they could have run back to their bedrooms and opened and closed doors without me being aware. The room remained feeling heavy. I didn't like it. I almost emailed the owner when I got home to see if he'd had others who stayed there who had had similar experiences. But I felt silly. It certainly wasn't sleep paralysis. I'm still not certain what I saw or experienced that night. I only told my family about it last year. I even tried researching the area, but found nothing. However, that land, tucked under the Santa Rosa Mountains, I'm sure has an interesting past.
Thank you so much to Kate for sharing that story with us. And just before we get to the creepy shadow figures, can I just say, I would risk my chances with those shadow figures to stay in that house because
it does sound awesome.
In the depths of British winter, those sunny days and being able to be outside without a million layers on. Just
and a pool.
And a pool. Oh, a pool. It sounds amazing. I would risk the ghosts. But the thing that was really interesting to me about these shadow figures was the blacker than black. We have seen this, and I know you've seen this specifically, and I'm thinking of, I think the most pronounced time you may have seen it was in your previous life when you managed buildings and you saw that figure just dart back into the doorway in a closed building.
Yeah.
Would you say that was the most sort of densely blacker than black shadow figure that you've seen?
Possibly that, or the thing I saw at the top of the stairs when we were doing the radio experiment.
Oh, yeah.
Sort of appeared like reverse melting out of the floor, and that was that sort of blacker than black. But it was dark, and I was looking in a mirror, so yeah, it depends like how like in depth you want to get, I suppose. Like, but yeah, it was that feeling. It was just that impenetrable darkness.
Yeah, almost like a blackness that just, well, as Kate says, sucks the light out of the surrounding atmosphere. I don't think I've seen full shadow figures that have been blacker than black. I've seen what we call skitterers, the kind of little shapes that kind of skitter in the corners of it in your peripheral vision. That was in our very haunted house. But I don't think I've seen a full sort of length blacker than black shadow figure. I'm racking my brains.
Or mini full length. Children's size.
These weren't. Yes, I guess these weren't full length, were they?
That was my favourite bit of the story, which is like one child, two child.
Wait,
I don't have three children.
That would have been absolutely terrifying. But I love the way they were lined up in high order, and it makes me think of children. You know, when the eldest child kind of takes the lead and goes first, it almost, I mean, we weren't there, so we can't say whether it had a playful, childish kind of feel to it. And it sounds like the room was rather heavy, so perhaps it didn't. But just the way they kind of lined up, it sounds like something children would do.
Yeah, it does. Like, I hadn't thought about it until you mentioned it, but whenever you see a photo of a family, the kids are always in high order. And I was in the cadets, and whenever we used to march anywhere and stuff, we all had to do high order.
Would you be in high order as well?
Yeah. And so, yeah, I see what you mean with that. And
but also just kind of standing there staring, that's kind of as Kate says, you know, if it was her own children, then obviously they just would have gone straight up to her in bed. But when it's curious children that are kind of staring at strangers, they stand there and stare.
They don't want to get too close as well, do they? Yeah.
They do kind of do that, just standing staring like with curiosity kind of thing. So
and you say that's kind of the impression I got, was that it was curious and not malevolent. I know she doesn't talk about it being malevolent other than the fact that the room is quite heavy. Yeah. And that's the impression I get. And I think a lot of like paranormal experiences, like that heavy feeling that makes your body feel a little bit uneasy, it's just that there's something not normal there. Not that it's bad or evil or scary, but just that it's different and your body kind of picks up on it. Yeah,
I'm with you. It's difficult because there are some locations that we've been to that did feel heavy in a sorrowful way or in a traumatic way, like there'd been a horrible accident or something like that, and that energy, that kind of sadness lingers. And I think that's a different kind of heavy atmosphere. So it is a difficult one because there's also the feeling that we've experienced in many other buildings and even in our house on occasion, although we know there's nothing, horrible or oppressive here. But it's just like you say, it feels heavy, but in more of a sense that, when there's a storm coming.
Yeah.
And there's like a thickness to the air almost, it feels a bit dense and it does feel a bit oppressive and
chewy.
Heavy. Yeah, a bit chewy. Literally, it really does. And obviously, a storm coming is just something completely natural. It doesn't mean anything. It's not bad. Well, I mean, it is if you're afraid of storms, to be fair. And I understand that.
Or if you're carrying an umbrella on a flat plane.
Well, yes, indeed. It can be bad. Sorry, I take my words back. But it's just a natural occurrence. But the atmosphere, you could describe it as feeling heavy. So it really, it depends. It really depends. There's two different sorts of heavy atmosphere, I think. And they're not all necessarily bad.
Indeed. Well, thank you, Kate, for that amazingly good story. I really enjoyed that. And it was... I love the pacing as well. It was just written in a way
very well written. Thank you.
It was just paced perfectly. So thank you again for sending in that story. It was brilliant. Well, it is time now for our next listener story, and this one is from Nancy.
My family, my husband and I and our 2 boys lived in a lovely home that we built ourselves in 2002 in a small town in Pennsylvania. The home was warm and welcoming, and nothing odd, save this experience, ever happened to us in our 19 years of being there. It was a typical night where my boys went up to bed, and then after watching some news, my husband and I soon followed. We had both been sleeping for a while when I was suddenly awoken by the feeling that there was another presence in our room. My back was to my husband and his back was to me. I instinctively knew that it wasn't one of my boys because they would have come right to me and woken me up. Then suddenly I had a tremendous cold feeling wash over me. It was as though I was in the presence of something very dark and very evil. I'm a coward by nature when it comes to scary things, but in this moment I was terrified and I didn't know why. I didn't have the courage to open my eyes for fear of what I would see, and even more fear of engaging with something that carried such an evil demeanour. Suddenly I realised that this thing was in bed with us. It was right in the space between my husband and I. The bed wasn't moving or anything like that, but I knew with all my heart that this thing was directly behind me. I felt it pressing up against me almost like it was spooning me. It's very hard to find the words to describe this. It was simply an overwhelming feeling of the presence of evil. I was absolutely terrified and tried to think of a way to alert my husband to what was going on. I was not about to move, turn over, to open my eyes, none of it. So I did the first thing that came to me. I began to recite the Lord's Prayer. I didn't do this audibly, but in my mind just recited over and over. Thankfully, after a brief time, it started to diminish, and I felt the darkness lift and move away. I can't tell you how many more times I recited the prayer for fear it would return. When I convinced myself that it had completely gone, I was still too terrified to turn over to my husband. Slowly, I got up the courage and I backed up right into my husband, turning over to face him. Still terrified, I softly whispered, "You've got to wake up. Please turn on the light." He woke up and sleepily asked me what was wrong. I told him to turn on his light and then quickly began to explain what just happened. He could see I was physically shaken, but for lack of knowing what else to say, he told me I must have had a bad dream. I told him it was not a dream. This had just happened in our bed. He did his best to calm me down, as he'd never seen me this shaken before. After a while, with the light still on, he fell back to sleep, and finally, after what seemed like forever, I did too. The next morning I described everything that had happened the night before, and I could tell he wasn't sure what to say. I definitely knew it was not a dream, and whatever it was that was next to me was pure dark evil. I've never felt anything like this before, and I really hope I never feel it again in my life. That same morning, my boys came down to eat breakfast and head to school. Sitting at the breakfast table, my youngest son turned to me and said, "Mum, why were you standing there watching me sleep last night?" My heart began to race, and I thought to myself, "Oh my God, that wasn't me." I did my best to stay calm and not let the shock show on my face. Calmly, I said to him, "What do you mean?" He said, "I woke up a few times and felt you just standing over my bed watching me. What was up with that?" Not wanting to alarm him or scare him, or give it away that I was nowhere near his room that night, I replied, "Oh, you know me. I couldn't sleep and I was just checking on you and making sure you were okay. Sorry if I bothered you." He simply shrugged his shoulders and went out the door to school. To this day, I have not had any more experiences like this, and I've only told this story to a few people. I've also never told this story to my sons, even though they're grown now and are out of the house. But I've never forgotten it either. I've never in my life had an encounter with something so dark and evil, and I hope I don't ever again.
And thank you to Nancy for sharing that story with us, especially because you say that you haven't really shared it with other people before.
Yeah, thank you for trusting us to share your story. And I'm really sorry that you had such an upsetting experience. It's such a shame when you'd been in that house for so long and it had been such a lovely, warm atmosphere. Now, I will say that having just a one-off experience in a house, in our personal experience from the sort of 7 odd years worth of other people's stories we've heard now, that's not actually unusual. You'd think it would be, especially you said you built the house yourself. So, with a new build house, you perhaps wouldn't expect it to have ghosts
something
and spirits.
residents already.
Yeah, exactly. But it does happen. Fitz, your childhood home was a new build, and there'd never been any tragedies or anything like that there, but you still had an apparition. And we've often wondered whether there's kind of a perfect storm of different elements that come together to create that manifestation. Now, obviously, nothing is proven in the world of the paranormal. This is all just speculation. And there are so many theories out there about what could cause or enable paranormal activity to kick off. And that can be anything from natural EMF to, infrasound, as we're going
to be discussing later.
Yeah, exactly. But one thing we've found plays a massive part in paranormal experiences that we've had in our lives and in this house and currently have in this house is our own stress levels. And I know that may sound really weird, but we really noticed it a lot more in lockdowns when there was a lot of high stress situations where we were waiting for announcements and news, and there was a real tense energy in the house that was kind of emanating from both of us. And we would find that we'd have all sorts of noises going on upstairs, these loud banging going off and things like that. And if we weren't used to our house having activity, it would have been absolutely terrifying. If that was the first time we'd ever come across it, it would have been really, really scary. And in fact, when we first started having activity in our house, we were really scared. I mean, I remember talking about it on this show. We had lived here for years. We'd never had anything happen before. There'd never been any vibe about the house. Nothing had ever happened. And then all of a sudden, stuff started appearing in the middle of the floor, disappearing out of thin air. We were having noises. It was really strange. And even us being sort of, hardened paranormal enthusiasts and going looking for this kind of stuff, because it was in our house, it was really freaky and scary. And it took us a long time to kind of, we had the opportunity to kind of take a step back from it and talk to it and calm ourselves down and kind of think around the problem. And once we'd done that, and, we had a span of years to do this over and a lot of experience and help from other people in the field, we realised that it wasn't actually scary after all. But it felt it in the, first instance.
That initial sort of shock of the unexpected is like like walking out of your bedroom door and bumping into your partner when you don't expect them there. Like, it's your partner, you love them, you get on great with them, but because they're unexpected,
it's still a shock.
It's a shock, and you jump.
So I really don't want you to think here that we're trying to tell you that your experience wasn't scary. Like, obviously it was, and I completely understand why it was. And we weren't there. Only you know how it felt, and we will take you at your word. But we just wanted to talk through some of this stuff because in your email, you asked for our thoughts. And you also mentioned that you were quite new to the world of the paranormal. So we wanted to just discuss, not just for you, but for other listeners as well who have found themselves in this situation, as we have previously found ourselves in this very situation. Some of the things that we've learned over the years, basically, and some of the things that we've experienced, just in case they're helpful to you or to somebody else who is listening to the story and thinking, oh my goodness, this is really resonating. Like I've had this happen to me and it was absolutely terrifying.
Yeah. And just to reiterate, we're not saying we think you have had necessarily one of these experiences, just that these are some potential explanations or things that other people have experienced and come up with as a reason.
Yeah, and from our own personal experience as well. Like the first thing I'll start with is, until we got to the point in the story about your son, I was thinking this felt very much like sleep paralysis. And I just, again, if you know this wasn't sleep paralysis because you've had it before and you know all about it, then that's, absolutely fine. Not trying to convince you otherwise. Only you know the situation you were in. But in case you haven't heard of sleep paralysis, I have experienced it. I experienced it when I was younger. And firstly, it's just awful. I know we've talked about this on the show before, but I think you're a fairly new listener. So yeah, it feels, well, I was going to say it feels like you're awake, but you are awake.
Basically, the part of your brain that stops you from thrashing about in your sleep and acting out your dreams is still on.
Yeah.
So you can't move.
Yeah, your brain has basically immobilized you as though you were asleep. So when you fall asleep, to stop you basically,
acting out your dreams. Basically.
Yeah, acting out your dreams, sleepwalking, going out into the street, doing whatever you're doing in your dream. Your brain has like an immobilization switch. So it turns off your body to a large degree. And sometimes when you wake up, and this does happen at times of, disruption, stress, tiredness, exhaustion, changes in life, as it happened to me, you can wake up. So your brain's awake, you can even open your eyes, you can see, you can look around the room. Sometimes you can mumble, but your body's actually still asleep. And I know that doesn't sound like it would feel much like a paranormal experience, except to be utterly terrifying, because to wake up and have your eyes open and you can't move, and sometimes you can't speak either, it's really dreadful. It's an awful feeling. But the other thing that we scientifically know can happen with sleep paralysis is this feeling of presence.
Yeah, presence and dread.
Yes.
I've had it happen.
High anxiety.
And it's it is literally terrifying. It's really horrifying. And sometimes it just feels like there's somebody just out of view.
Sometimes people can actually see. Sometimes you can hallucinate with it as well.
I was going to say, sometimes you actually see them because your brain is in that state sort of between waking and sleeping. And you feel like you're wide awake.
Yeah.
Like you feel like almost like you've been shocked awake.
Yes.
In that sort of terrifying, heart-thumping fear.
Yeah, and I think probably a lot of the reason for that is because your brain knows there is something terribly wrong. Something's gone a bit miswired, your brain's awake and your body's not. And of course, your body's flooding your brain with alert signals like there's something wrong, we're in danger, which makes sense. So it puts your body into this fight or flight kind of state of being. And being sort of between awake and asleep and not processing at kind of full whack, your brain will often interpret that as there's something there, there's danger there. And people have reported the feeling of somebody sitting on their chest, like a heavy pressure on their body, somebody touching them, like you feel physical sensations with it as well. And again, just want to reiterate, not saying that we're trying to imply this is what happened. I'm just we haven't talked about it in a while, and I think it is a good thing to discuss because it's actually quite common. And I know when I first experienced it, I had no idea what it was. I'd never heard of sleep paralysis. I just thought there was something dreadfully, awfully wrong. Couldn't explain it to myself at all. And that is the most terrifying thing, is just not knowing.
Yeah, I think it's the most terrifying, I was going to say paranormal experience, but it's not necessarily paranormal.
No.
It's just, your brain being silly. But it's more terrifying than anything paranormal I've encountered, I think.
Yeah, I think it definitely is. I don't think I've ever been as scared as I was when I had sleep paralysis. And yeah, I don't think I saw anything, but there was definitely that feeling of doom and dread and a presence and something watching. And
yeah, I've seen things.
Yeah.
Like in the doorway, and you just can't run away. So
no.
it just builds up that fear and makes it worse. It's horrible.
And, if anybody comes across this for the first time and doesn't know about it, it's just so much more scary than knowing. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not saying that can never happen with paranormal experiences, because I have had it happen at the same time as paranormal activity, but the two weren't, well, I don't think the two were related.
Yeah.
I think the possible relationship there is what I mentioned earlier, your levels of stress at the time. And that's kind of why I brought it up, because normally sleep paralysis happens at times of high stress. But equally, we know from experience that times of high stress can also kick off paranormal activity.
Yes.
So there is a bit of a crossover there. And of course, then we get to the part about your son also having an experience. The thing that struck me about that, though, is that your son thought that the presence was you.
Yeah, he obviously wasn't getting that terrifying feeling.
No.
It was just, Mum's here.
Obviously, I can completely understand why, when your son comes out the breakfast table and says there was somebody standing, I felt somebody standing over me, that must be awful as a parent. That must be absolutely dreadfully terrifying. But what I thought about that was that if he thought the presence was you, then it can't have felt terrifying, I would think, because he wouldn't be terrified by his mother. So I wonder, and I can completely understand why you didn't want to go into it with him at the time, but I wonder in hindsight what kind of feeling he was getting. He obviously felt that there was somebody standing there, but maybe he wasn't getting a negative vibe from it.
And this kind of goes back a little bit to what we said about Kate's story as well, in that a lot of these experiences can feel terrifying because your body is saying something strange is happening. This is not normal.
Yeah.
And we react to it with fear and terror instead of confusion.
Yeah.
And interest. It's just like, oh, something bad is happening now.
And of course, that makes sense, because that is a self-preservation technique. It's something we've evolved to do. It keeps us safe. To respond to something unknown with fear is more likely to, in a survival situation.
Yeah, if in doubt, run.
Yeah, if in doubt, run. If there's a cave lion hiding in the bushes, then that running away is going to keep you safe.
Yeah,
so it's a completely normal,
isn't it?
Completely normal, natural thing to do, and we all do it because we're human beings. But things can get really interesting if you're in a safe situation and you're able to take a step back from that and re-examine things and think, well, yeah, of course it felt terrifying. Like, nothing's ever going to take away from the fact that in the moment it was terrifying. But is there another element to it? Could it have been something that was merely curious? Could it have been something that was just initiated by this weird, random conglomeration of events or, weird atmospheric conditions or something like that, and it just threw up this thing that then never happened again? Possibly because that set of conditions never happened again. Now, I know we've talked about this quite a lot, but it's such a big topic. There are so many elements we could dive into here and, really dig down into. We could do a whole other episode just on this alone. So if there's anything we haven't talked about that you wanted us to, Nancy, if we haven't addressed anything that you wanted us to, do get in touch. And please feel free to ask more questions, or if anybody else who's listened to this story and felt it resonated with them, again, if you have questions, do get in touch. It's difficult for us to sort of remember all the points we want to say sometimes in an episode. We have a limited time when we're talking about these stories. And if we've glossed over anything you want us to go in more depth in, or if you want to hear any more about our experiences on anything particular we've mentioned, yeah, just ask and we can talk more about it.
And we also have a Facebook group, which is full of absolutely wonderful people who have all had these sorts of experiences themselves. And I'm sure they would be more than willing to talk through your experience with you if there's something, again, that you feel like you wanted to discuss further.
Yeah, we're really, really lucky to have an amazing group of people in our Facebook group. It's a really safe, supportive place, which is one of the reasons we started the show, was to try and create a really safe, supportive space, because we know that it can be really difficult to talk about paranormal experiences sometimes. And there can be, a lot of spaces where people are judgmental or, won't take you at your word or try and imply things. Like it can be a bit of a minefield out there. And we've just been incredibly lucky with our amazing community. They are so warm and welcoming and supportive.
Yes, you're all lovely.
We love you. Well, thank you again so much to Nancy for sharing that story. I'm really glad you found us, and I'm really glad your house settled down after that. And now I think it's time for our last listener story of the episode, and this one is from Kat.
I had a best friend who lived close by. Her house had an old workers' bar in the basement. Cool, right? No, it wasn't. It was terrifying. I never ventured down there on my own. I can't recall exactly how old I was, but I was definitely primary school age. We were down in the basement playing, and from behind me, where the room with the old bar was, I felt a hand slowly grasp my shoulders. I felt each finger separately touch my shoulder and tightly grip. I screamed and refused to go back down. That whole house was absolutely terrifying. My friend and I used to spend a lot of time together in her house. It was a Victorian terraced house with 4 floors. The house had a basement where the creepy bar was, a ground floor with the living room and kitchen, upstairs with the bedrooms and bathroom, and then a converted attic room. Sometimes I'd sleep over, but her bedroom was smaller than mine was, so we slept in the living room in sleeping bags. One night, I was wide awake as usual, and my friend had fallen fast asleep. I always asked that the living room curtains be left open slightly so the street light from the main road outside could spill into the room. I remember watching the car lights float across the walls when I saw what looked like a person quickly walk past the frosted glass in the living room door. I froze. To my absolute horror, the kitchen light spilled into the hallway. Someone had turned the light on. I whispered to my friend, panicked, "Wake up! Oi, wake up!" Unfortunately, when my friend slept, she practically joined the dead. I had no choice. I lightly started slapping my friend's face. "Come on, please, wake up." She finally woke, and she wasn't pleased. "What are you doing? What's up?" she asked, visibly tired and annoyed. I pointed to the living room door, where you could clearly see the kitchen light spilling into the hallway through the frosted glass. She looked confused and said, "Probably my dad or something." I shook my head. "I don't think it was. I saw a person walk past the door, then the light went on, but they came from the direction of your front door. I didn't hear the front door." I must mention that my friend's front door made a distinct squeaking noise when opened or shut, as it used to stick a lot, so you practically had to barge it open. Her face crumpled in a confused look. "Go see then," she said. I shook my head. "I'm not going anywhere near that on my own. It's your house." She huffed, got up and stomped out of the room. I held my breath for a minute, and then she returned quicker than she left. She'd turned the kitchen light off and told me no one was there. She asked if I was sure I saw something. I was sure, and I'm still sure. There were a few more experiences in that house. My friend barely ever believed me, regardless of what she also witnessed. I only ever felt safe or calm in the kitchen. Everywhere else in that house felt like it had eyes in the walls. Creepy. The basement, though, that was downright terrifying.
And thank you so much to Kat for sharing that story. We've had some really scary stories on this episode, and you guys are so good at writing out your stories and relating what happened to you you just tell it so well. It really conjures up the whole experience. Everybody's written in their stories today so well. It blows my mind.
Yeah,
you guys are great.
The best bit for me in that one was like I felt the fingers on my shoulder one by one.
Oh, my favourite bit was when the friend wouldn't wake up. Because it just that would be you. Yeah. I'd be there lightly slapping your face.
Lightly slapping?
Well, yeah.
You could punch me and I wouldn't wake up.
But I wouldn't.
I know you wouldn't, but I'm just saying.
Yeah, a train could come through the house and you still wouldn't wake up.
I was in the cadets and we used to go on exercise and we used to go and shooting competitions. I can sleep.
Literally
about
sleep
100
through
people
gunfire.
Firing rifles next to my head.
Yeah.
When I sleep, I mean business.
He is not kidding. The other part of that story, it really gave me chills. The bit where they see the figure go past the frosted glass.
Yeah.
Because do you know what it reminded me of? It reminded me of that episode of Paranormal Lockdown where the two investigators were staying at 30 East Drive.
Oh, yeah.
The house of the Black Monk of Pontefract, and they actually caught a figure rushing past the frosted glass pane in the window of the living room door, and it just instantly brought that to mind, and I got goosebumps.
See, I didn't. That for me felt very much like my old parents' house. It felt like Jack walking past the window, or when I saw my parents' friend who was working on the porch outside the frosted glass window.
Yeah, okay.
That was what came to me, but that's because I've had that experience.
But that's a really good example of we've had a theme to these. I feel like we've got a story theme in a way going on here, and the commentary that has come up around them. And it wasn't really intentional, but that really Fitz is looking at me like wasn't intentional. He picked the stories, so obviously he knew there was a theme.
It was intentional.
Sorry, I do beg your pardon.
I themed the stories this episode,
but you didn't theme the commentary.
No.
So what seems to have come up this episode, that really ties back into how much how you see an experience depends on just the connections that you make. You hear a figure rushing past a frosted glass window, and it takes you back to pleasant experiences that you've had where you've seen, a loving, not a loving, I was going to say loving family member, but it wasn't. It was a friend, wasn't it? A really good friend.
Well, no, walking past the window was Jack.
Was a family member.
Stood outside through the frosted glass was the friend building the front porch. So it's kind of both.
But yeah, so apparitions that you know and love and are familiar to you. And yes, they're ghosts, but it's like a pleasant atmosphere. It's nothing scary to you. Whereas I have not seen anything like that personally. That's not in my personal repertoire of experiences. So my mind immediately just made the connection to that really creepy footage in that TV show, because that's the closest thing I can get to. So I found it creepy, and you were like, no, that's not creepy at all.
And the impression I got was just something in the house just pottering downstairs to get themselves a drink in the middle of the night, and it just happened. It wasn't an alive thing. Yeah,
I think that's a really interesting. I think it's really interesting that we seem to have come kind of full circle, and that almost sums up everything that we've talked about with all of these stories, and it actually wasn't intentional. Well, that was a lovely, if unintentional, way to wrap up the stories from this episode, and that was the last story for today. But fear not, do not go anywhere yet. There is more to come, and for this next section, I would grab yourself at least a hot beverage and a couple of biscuits.
This one might even need a toasty.
a toasty. Maybe a hot cross bun. Scone. Hot buttered scone.
So, without further ado, prepare yourselves to enter the world of infrasound and the paranormal.
Now, this is not the episode that we'd planned to do this month. We had a big paranormal postcard trip planned to write up for this episode, but England has been beset by various storms this winter, and on the day we had booked to go, a storm rolled in with 90-mile-per-hour winds and we had to abandon our trip. As we haven't quite managed to reschedule that trip yet, we simply swapped around to the next episode we had planned, and that was going to be a follow-up episode to our paranormal postcard, because when we were doing our initial research into the location, we came across something very interesting that we knew would need a whole episode all of its own. We had planned to visit the historic city of Coventry, somewhere I had visited as a teen and found incredibly atmospheric. I've been meaning to go back for years and it just felt like the right time. And, having been one of the best preserved examples of a medieval city before what was known as the Coventry Blitz, a horrific World War II aerial bombing raid in 1940, it seemed like a likely place to find a rich vein of ghost stories. And we weren't wrong, but we found something else odd as well. Every search for ghosts and hauntings in Coventry would throw up articles relating to an engineering designer and lecturer at Coventry University named Vic Tandy, and an experiment he conducted in a 14th century cellar under the historic streets of Coventry that was reputed to be haunted. The fact that a steady stream of people seemed to be having inexplicable experiences in this cellar, and oftentimes exiting rapidly, pale, clammy, shaken and refusing to re-enter, might not seem surprising, given the number of hauntings reported in the near vicinity and around the streets of Coventry city centre, something that we will delve into much deeper in a future episode when we've been able to visit for ourselves. But Tandy's experiment brought a whole new perspective to paranormal investigating, one that still reverberates through the paranormal world today.
The sandstone vaulted cellar at the centre of the experiment once belonged to a 14th century merchant's house on Bailey Lane, a street that got its name from a castle long since demolished. Like so many cities, after the Norman invasion of 1066, a castle was built in the heart of Coventry. But unlike many others we've encountered, it didn't stand the test of time. It was originally built around the end of the 11th century and withstood attacks from King Stephen during the Anarchy. But either it suffered some damage in the process or was in need of an upgrade, as records show rebuilding work taking place in 1137. This new building suffered further damage in 1173 during attacks by King Henry II, and after this, it seems to have fallen out of use and been left to decay. A letter from Queen Elizabeth I in 1569 asking for Mary Queen of Scots to be held in Coventry Castle shows that it was still at least partly standing in the 16th century, but the reply to the Queen was that the castle was in too great a state of disrepair to accommodate Mary, and from this point on, it was never repaired again, instead being eventually abandoned and the material most likely carted off for building use elsewhere. Instead, the area around the site of the castle became the focus for trade, and merchants began to settle around the site that was once the castle bailey. One particular road developed that would have once passed through, or maybe exited from, the Old Bailey, and this became very aptly known as Bailey Lane. And it's on this lane that a merchant's house was built in the 14th century, and that house had an undercroft, a room with vaulted ceilings and niches carved into the sandstone walls that would once have been shuttered with lockable doors for storing valuable goods such as spices. At the beginning of its life, the room would have had an entrance onto the street at one side, making it an undercroft rather than a cellar, but over the long centuries, The city of Coventry grew and changed, and so did the ground level, eventually rising high enough to bury the exposed side of the Undercroft entirely. During the 400 or so years that this change was happening, the house was inhabited by a succession of girdlers, mercers, weavers and clothiers, all making their living from Coventry's thriving textile trade. This tradition continued from the first recorded tenants in the year 1410 all the way to the 1800s, even surviving the house being split into two separate dwellings in 1752, when it became known, as it's still remembered today, 38 to 39 Bailey Lane. By the 1800s, ownership of the property passed out of the hands of textile merchants and into the hands of a succession of solicitors from 1841 right up to 1940. And the last practice to have inhabited the building still remains in Coventry today, one of the oldest legal firms in Britain. But, alas, this storied building was lost to us forever one dreadful November night in 1940, when fires from a World War II bombing attack razed through the city, destroying hundreds of buildings, including 38 to 39 Bailey Lane. But, tucked safely underneath the city streets, the building's cellar remained. The fire damage to the building was so severe that the 14th century merchant's house was declared beyond repair, and planning requests to rebuild the medieval property were refused. And so, the cellar lay closed up and forgotten for some time. Frustratingly, from this point on, we haven't been able to piece together a solid timeline of what happened to the cellar over the next few decades. The land where the house once stood was purchased by the Coventry Corporation and earmarked to be the site of a new museum and art gallery, thanks to a generous donation by local philanthropist and industrialist Sir Alfred Herbert. Local history information tells us that the Herbert Museum and Art Gallery started construction in 1954 and finally opened in 1960, but there's no mention of the medieval Undercroft. Some online information claims that the Undercroft was rediscovered during extension work to the Herbert Gallery and Museum between 2007 and 2008. Yet the Historic England listed building entry dates the cellar's first listing way back in 1955. The paper that we're going to be most concerned with today, however, links the rediscovery of the cellar to excavations for the foundations of a tourist information centre, which, in the year 2000, when the paper was written, reportedly stood on top of the medieval Undercroft. The paper in question was written by none other than engineer and university lecturer Vic Tandy.
At that time, staff at the Coventry Tourist Information Centre would give tours of the 14th century cellar to interested visitors. But the more tours they did, the more they began to notice some rather strange reactions from their guests, as tourists would emerge from underground looking pale, ill, shaken, and occasionally even fleeing from something unseen. In 1997, a Canadian journalist began feeling unsettled on a tour of the Undercroft as soon as he crossed the threshold of the room. The tour guide with him noticed the man freeze on the spot, then watched in concern as he saw all the colour drain from his face and the hair raise up in goosebumps on his arms. The guide escorted the visitor back out of the cellar, worried for his well-being. Once safely above ground, the journalist described how he had felt a presence immediately upon entering the room, followed by a feeling of pressure or touch on his body that he described as like a balloon being pushed between his shoulder blades. And then, even more disturbingly, he became aware of a woman's face peering over his right shoulder. This seems to have been the first reported incident of spooky goings-on in the medieval Undercroft, but it certainly wouldn't be the last. Another visitor, a gentleman from Latvia, described feeling a presence and a cold chill upon entering the room, whilst a married couple from the USA had to cut their visit short after the wife suddenly stopped at the threshold of the room, describing a strong presence that felt like it was actually barring her way. The pale-looking woman either could not or would not enter the cellar despite her husband's encouragement, although neither he nor the tour guide experienced anything out of the ordinary. One of the female tour guides also experienced the odd sensations in the cellar and declared that she hated going down there due to the strong sense of a presence and a strange chill. She described the sensation as feeling as though she were intruding, to the point where she would find herself talking to the empty space as though someone else were down there with her. She reported that many visitors she took down for a tour also sensed a strange and unsettling atmosphere about the place, many of whom were from overseas, making it less likely that they had heard any stories about the spookiness of the cellar prior to arriving. But one person who did hear about the increasing reports of spooky happenings underneath the Tourist Information Centre was Vic Tandy. At that time, Tandy was lecturing at Coventry University, which, rather handily, is situated right next door to the Herbert Museum and Art Gallery, and at that time, the Tourist Information Centre above the Undercroft. And it just so happened that Tandy had good reason to have a particular interest in spaces that elicited unsettling feelings of an unseen presence. Given that Tandy was a member of the Society for Psychical Research, it follows that the man had an interest in paranormal phenomena. But the thing that had the chartered engineer heading down into the Undercroft to investigate the strange happenings for himself was a personal experience he had had whilst working in a lab in Warwickshire. Some years earlier, Tandy had been an engineering designer, working on medical equipment in a lab housed in a structure that was essentially two back-to-back garages. And, according to Tandy's colleagues, this lab was haunted. Tandy, however, brushed aside the claims of odd noises and feelings, putting it down to the fact that some of the medical equipment they produced on site made some pretty odd noises. Even when he heard more stories from other staff in the building, a colleague who turned around to speak to an empty space that he was convinced had contained a real person, so strong was the sense of someone there in their periphery, a cleaner who handed in her notice after experiencing an unearthly chill and seeing something grey moving out of the corner of her eye. But Tandy pronounced himself a hard-nosed engineer and remained sceptical of any paranormal happenings. Until, that is, it happened to him.
One evening, he was working late in the lab alone and began to notice the things the other staff had spoken about. An odd atmosphere began to descend, and Vic grew more and more uncomfortable. He could clearly identify that there were, as he had supposed, some odd but entirely explainable noises coming from the creaks and groans of the settling building, the medical equipment wheezing, and the feral neighbourhood cats scratching around outside. But there was something else too, a feeling that Vic wasn't alone, even though all the other staff had gone home. In fact, he became so uncomfortable that he went around the lab and checked for leaks in the oxygen and carbon dioxide bottles that made up part of the lab's equipment, in case some malfunction there was making him feel so peculiar. But finding nothing, he decided to make himself a comforting cup of coffee and carry on with his work. The feeling didn't leave, though. In fact, it grew creepingly in intensity, until Vic found himself chilled and yet sweating at the same time. And then, he felt someone else's eyes on him. He was being watched. Slowly, in the periphery of his vision, a figure emerged. A grey, indistinct figure, moving just as a person would, but making absolutely no sound. Admittedly terrified by now, Vic turned to face the impossible figure in the empty lab. But as he turned his head, it simply disappeared. So, did the hard-nosed engineer have a change of heart about the building being haunted? Well, what happened next was about to throw a whole other light on the situation that really got the cogs in Vic's brain turning, and it started the very next day, when he brought his sword into the lab. Now, that may not have been a sentence that you were expecting to hear in the context of an engineering lab making medical equipment, but you see, Vic was a keen fencer, and was actually entering a fencing competition that necessitated him fitting a handle to a new foil blade. Deciding that it would be much easier to use the vices and cutting equipment at the lab to do this, he set about his project, this time in the more comforting light of day, and with other people around, settling his fears from the spooky events of the night before. He didn't remain comforted for long though, as when he returned from fetching some oil to the bench vise in which he'd clamped his sword, he noticed the foil visibly vibrating in its clamp, moved by some unseen force. All sorts of frightening thoughts flitted through his mind for a moment, but after a second, Vic's engineering logic kicked in, and he thought to himself, if the sword is moving, that must mean it's receiving energy. But from where? And the answer he came up with was from sound, or more specifically, infrasound. There was nothing loud enough that he could hear to create such an effect, but there could be sound below the threshold of human hearing that could be affecting the resonant frequency of the blade, an effect that would seem to most of us an invisible, inexplicable force. So, scientific curiosity now fully engaged, Vic started to experiment, moving the blade around the room in the vise and noting that it vibrated more violently towards the centre of the room and less so in other areas. Therefore, he reasoned, the frequency affecting the blade must have something to do with the room itself, and how the low or unheard sound was interacting with that space. Normally, sound waves will travel through air from their source, but Vic postulated that the reason the energy seemed to peak in the centre of the room was because the particular qualities of the space and the wavelength of the unheard sound he was encountering were a certain resonance that enabled the wave to be reflected back from each end of the lab, creating a heightened peak of energy at the spot where he found the sword would vibrate most violently. Vic described this in a report written several years later in 1998 for the Society of Psychical Research as a standing wave. And not content with just this theory, he went a little further and tried to put a number on the frequency that was causing this spooky effect. So, using the length of the room and the equation of frequency equals velocity of sound over wavelength, the number he came up with was 18.98 Hz, a frequency just below the level of human hearing, which typically starts at around 20 Hz.
So, by now you may have some questions, such as, what could be causing this low-frequency sound? How can you even have a sound that you can't hear? And what has all of this got to do with ghosts or a haunted cellar in Coventry? Well, the cause of the infrasound seemed to be simple enough. After a chat with the works foreman, Tandy discovered that a new extractor fan had recently been installed in the building. This seemed like a highly likely culprit for the mysterious standing wave, as machinery is a well-known source for emitting low frequencies and sometimes infrasound. Sure enough, as soon as the fan was turned off, the strange effect of the vibrating sword immediately ceased, very much seeming to prove Vic's theory. So, moving on to how you can have sounds that we can't hear, and what is infrasound anyway? Well, in simple terms, sound is just vibrations and waves. And, within a certain spectrum, our human ears can perceive those waves as sound. But we're limited to a range of around 20 to 20,000 hertz, although it can vary slightly from person to person. Animals like dogs and bats can hear higher frequencies than we can, and animals like some whales can hear lower frequencies than us. Infrasound is just sound that occupies frequencies below the level of normal human hearing, so frequencies below around 20 Hz. But for a more in-depth answer, I want to read you a quote from a study by Jason Braithwaite and Maurice Townsend, the rather wonderfully titled Good Vibrations, the Case for a Specific Effect of Infrasound in Instances of Anomalous Experience has yet to be empirically demonstrated. It's a bit of a wordy quote, much like the title, but I like the way this makes us switch up our perspective on sound and puts us into a good mindset for really understanding the complexities of sound and infrasound and how they might tie into the world of the paranormal. Let us begin with a well-known puzzle. If a tree falls over in the woods and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? When presented with this for the first time, many people generate an elaborate series of explanations for why it does make a sound. It's just that as no one is there to hear it, it is simply not heard. However, in contrast to intuition, the correct answer to the puzzle is no. It does not make a sound. The key to solving this puzzle is the combined information of no one being there to experience the falling tree and the word sound. Sound is a perceptual phenomenon, an emerging property of the auditory components of the ear and brain, transforming an ambiguous external vibration into the perception of coherent sound. Therefore, in the absence of a human observer, and thus a brain, the falling tree cannot actually make a sound. It is only capable of making a vibration through the air. So out in the real world, events generate vibration, not sound, which is transformed into sound by the ear and brain of the observer. And so, what does all this have to do with ghosts? Well, Tandy was aware of some scientific studies that seemed to indicate that infrasound, although unheard, could nevertheless have some very physical effects on the human body, and he dove into further research on the topic, including clinical studies and 2 reports from NASA, and found that some very dramatic effects had been observed in humans exposed to high levels of infrasound, including feelings of unease and an oppressive atmosphere, sweating, nausea, headaches, ear pain, sensations of fear including chills and shivering, even a blurring of the vision caused when high enough levels of infrasound actually made the eyeballs vibrate. Vic was pretty sure he'd hit the jackpot, and that maybe his spooky lab wasn't haunted at all. The staff had merely been subject to the influence of an unseen visitor in the form of infrasound. But of course, it wasn't all quite so cut and dry as that, as we shall come to discover. But from the off, many people in the paranormal field latched onto this theory as the ultimate explanation for any and all supposedly paranormal activity, and die-hard skeptics would unfortunately bandy it around as a blanket explanation for any unexplained happenings that they couldn't find another practical source for. And that's a shame, because it really doesn't seem like that was what Vic intended at all, even as the self-proclaimed hard-nosed engineer that he was. After all, he was a member of the Society for Psychical Research. He was curious about ghosts and hauntings. But like any good investigator, he knew the importance of first eliminating any earthly, mundane cause of supposedly strange activity in order to be able to focus in on what's left that may be truly unexplained. And he writes as much at the very beginning of his article for the SPR on his experience in the lab. When investigating a haunted building, it's good practice to attempt to exclude as many possible normal causes for the haunting as possible. The ways in which normal earthly events might conspire to convey an impression that a house is haunted are numerous. The exclusion of these counter-explanations, when potentially relevant, must be the first priority of the spontaneous case investigator. But he remained open-minded in his investigations. In an interview with the Guardian newspaper, Tandy was asked if he thought 21st century science would confine ghosts to history by explaining them away. Tandy replied, "Not necessarily. When it comes to supernatural phenomena, I'm sitting on the fence, and that's where scientists should be until we've proved that there isn't anything." Wise words, and a sentiment I very much respect. And now, back to that haunted cellar in Coventry.
With Tandy working in the university buildings adjacent to the Tourist Information Office, it didn't take long for him to get wind of the reports from staff and tourists of the spooky vibe in the medieval Undercroft. And you can probably see by now how, to Tandy, it sounded very reminiscent of what he'd experienced in his Warwickshire lab a few years before. People were experiencing an oppressive atmosphere, a strange chill, the sense of a presence, and emerging pale, shaken, and feeling unwell. Could this haunting too be the result of the effect of infrasound on the human body? Of course, there was that one visitor who actually saw the face of a woman peering over his shoulder, and both a cleaner at the lab and Tandy himself had seen a grey figure moving silently about the building, something which hadn't been reported in the studies conducted on infrasound in the past. But they had indicated a blurring or smearing of the vision, and Tandy wondered whether this was enough to cause actual apparitions to be seen by those affected. He couldn't wait to get down into the cellar and find out for himself, and this time he didn't have to rely on mere calculations either. His ties with the university meant that he could now borrow equipment that could measure any infrasound that was present. So, kitted out with a precision sound level meter, analyzer, and a microphone sensitive to frequencies down to 1 Hz, Vic and 2 university colleagues, Sam Maunder and Bill Dunn, set up their equipment in the Undercroft, leaving it running in the centre of the cellar to sample and average any ambient sounds whilst the team withdrew. On their return, they were shocked at what they found. Even from this first small sample, they immediately saw that there was a clear peak at a frequency of 19 Hz that was recorded at a significantly higher amplitude than the rest of the background noise, meaning that had these sounds been audible to the human ear, the frequency of 19 Hz would have been by far the loudest sound in the ambient noise. They couldn't believe their eyes when they looked at the reading. They had come in with half a hope that they might find some correlation to Tandy's so-called ghost frequency that he'd calculated at the lab to be 18.98 Hz. And yet, here they were, in a medieval cellar rife with reports of unsettling phenomena, only to discover so quickly an almost identical frequency above the level of other background noise, and again, just below the level of typical human hearing. Maybe it was a fluke. They repeated the measurement several times over the next 3 hours, but the results remained consistent, which, as Tandy admitted, was rather surprising in itself. He also admitted that finding out the source of the infrasound was almost impossible. He included many calculations in his article as to how the shape and dimensions of the cellar might contribute to the resonance, and speculated that the crooked corridor leading to the cellar and the doorway into it might act almost like the finger hole on a wind instrument. A complex relationship he thought contributed to the 19 Hz resonance, and seemed to tie in with the fact that most visitors had their discomforting experiences in that very corridor at the threshold of the doorway. But beyond this, the actual source of the infrasound remained a mystery. However, the correlation between his calculations at the Warwickshire lab and his findings at the Coventry cellar were enough to convince many amongst the paranormal community that he had proven his hypothesis, and a slew of articles ensued about the discovery of the ghost frequency. Tandy was invited to many interviews and even appeared on the BBC TV documentary Ghosts on the Underground, where he was invited to bring his measuring equipment and put his theory to the test in arguably one of the most haunted places in England, the London Underground. If you've followed us for a while, you will have undoubtedly heard us talk about the ghosts on the Underground before. You may even have watched along with us at our Halloween watch party, and that's because we still consider it to be one of the best paranormal documentaries out there. It's really quite down to earth and factual in style, but the stories told by eyewitnesses are just incredible. I've lost count of how many times we've watched it, and these first-hand accounts still give me goosebumps every time. If you know anything much about the London Underground, you'll know it seems a very likely place to encounter ghosts. As we discovered in our Christmas episode, railways are, sadly, often places of tragic accidents, something so often associated with hauntings. But also the very building of the London Underground had a pretty grisly history. Tunnelling under such a highly populated and ancient city was bound to displace a few graves along the way, and in fact, it unearthed more bodies than even the designers ever imagined. Not only displacing cemeteries, but also cutting through long-forgotten plague pits, huge emergency trenches dug at the height of the 1665 plague, in which hundreds of bodies were haphazardly and unceremoniously laid to rest when churchyards ran out of space and communities started to run out of people to bury their families, friends and neighbours. At least one of the London Underground stations is thought to stand on the site of one of these disturbed plague pits. Add to that the 160-odd years that the Underground has been in service, not just for travel but also emergency shelter for thousands of people during the World War II Blitz, when people ate, slept, mourned, celebrated, and even gave birth down there. You seem to have just about every ingredient for the recipe of a haunting that it's possible to have. And if you've seen the documentary, you'll know that this recipe certainly seems to have been proven out in this case. And if you haven't seen it yet, I highly recommend that you do.
Sadly for us, Tandy didn't get to investigate the whole of the London Underground with his infrasound measuring equipment. But with the limited time and access that he had, the programme focused in on 3 locations well known for their paranormal reports: Page's Walk, Bethnal Green, and Kennington Loop. As predicted, Tandy did record high levels of infrasound at all locations, with as high as 80 decibels at Bethnal Green and even higher on the Kennington Loop, with the highest recorded level of 95 decibels, which Tandy equated to a level similar to the loudest disco you could stand if the sound had been audible to human ears. It's worth noting that these levels are much, much higher than the 38 decibels of infrasound he recorded in the Coventry Undercroft. Page's Walk is actually a disused tunnel near Embankment Station on the Bakerloo line, and it's not open to the public. Here, station staff and contractors have reported an oppressive atmosphere, feelings of being watched, strange chills and drops in temperature, doors banging open and closed of their own accord, and generally eerie and uncomfortable feelings. One contractor they spoke to said that he had worked in plenty of historic and supposedly creepy places, but Page's Walk was the only one that had ever affected him. He described feeling a sense of unease from his very first day on the job, a feeling that something was watching and that something didn't want him there. When Tandy went into the creepy, disused tunnel, he found not only high levels of infrasound, but also an eerie pushing and sucking draft caused by trains coming and going in other tunnels. This created odd temperature drops and caused the doors to open and close by themselves, as indeed they did several times right in front of the engineer, inching closed with a satisfyingly creepy creak before loudly slamming shut. This was the perfect context for Tandy's infrasound theory. The odd draft in the tunnel causing chills and the unsettling door slamming all fostered a sense of unease, providing the perfect backdrop for the very physical sense of unease caused by the high levels of infrasound he found down there to take on a feeling of something otherworldly. But the other locations were not so clear-cut. In the Bethnal Green station office, there have been reports from staff of a sense of unease, which could possibly be accounted for by the 80 decibels of infrasound Tandy recorded there. But that's by no means the limit of the paranormal reports at the station, and there's another, very valid reason that people might feel uncomfortable at the station, for sadly, Bethnal Green was the site of the worst civilian disaster of the Second World War in England. During the bombing raids of the Blitz and the years following, hundreds of London residents took shelter underground in the city's various tube stations, and Bethnal Green was no different. But one March night in 1943, the safety of the underground tunnels took a horrible turn when a surge of people entering the underground at Bethnal Green had catastrophic consequences. Someone descending the badly lit steps fell, and with poor lighting and no handrails, this misstep caused several other people to fall. Amid rising panic, with air raid sirens and the sounds of bombs falling outside, a terrible domino effect and crush ensued, and 173 people died, 146 of whom were women and children. The BBC documentary makers interviewed a station foreman who was working alone on a night shift at Bethnal Green Station in spring of 1981. He described how everything was normal as he started to shut up for the night. The other staff went home, he turned off some of the station lights and settled down to his paperwork. But then, something happened that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He told the documentary crew, "I was just sitting there and I heard the sound of children crying at first, and I dismissed it as nothing really. And then all of a sudden, it seemed to get sort of loud. There was voices of women and people screaming and loud noises, and a combination of everything. It built up to quite a frightening situation, really. It seemed to go on for about 10 or 15 minutes, and it was just like people were panicking, to the point where I left the office and went up to the top of the booking hall. I was frightened to go back to the office because of the noise down there. It was quite frightening, actually. Even when I go through Bethnal Green to this day, I can't forget it." Tandy didn't try and suggest that this experience could have been caused by infrasound alone. He did do some experiments outside on the street, synthesizing sounds similar to that of a scream to see if the sound would travel into the station office, and he found that it did. But could that adequately explain what the station foreman heard that night in 1981? I struggle to see how the terrifying cacophony that he described could be explained by noise from the street, unless there was some kind of emergency or major incident that he would surely have heard about later, especially not the sounds of children late on a cold spring night after closing time. And even more perplexing was Kennington Loop. Here, Tandy noted the highest of all his infrasound recordings, in a tight loop of tunnel apparently much hated by drivers. The loop only exists to allow trains to turn around, and no members of the public are permitted in it, all passengers being required to disembark at the station before the loop. But there have been many occasions when train drivers have become convinced that not all passengers did actually get off. Sometimes, as they wait in the uneasy silence of the tight loop, they can hear voices. On some occasions, they can also hear doors banging, and sometimes they hear the carriage doors opening and closing as if someone is moving up the train towards the driver, the sounds growing closer and closer until they venture out to investigate, certain that a stray passenger has managed to stay aboard. But they are always met with empty and silent carriages. The thing is, though, that sometimes they find many of those empty carriages with their doors wide open, where before the doors had all been closed. Tandy admitted that as much as infrasound might cause feelings of unease and a sense of the paranormal, it certainly couldn't open train carriage doors in succession.
But of course, what we all want to know is, can infrasound make you see ghosts? Was the extractor fan in Vic Tandy's lab the cause of the grey figures that both he and the cleaner saw, or the woman's face seen by a visitor to the medieval cellar? Well, to answer that, we need to look at some studies from more recent years that have picked up where Tandy's research left off, and in many cases, critiqued Tandy and his colleagues' methods. And I just want to make clear that this isn't so we can have a go at Tandy or pull his research methods apart for the sake of it. It's just that to further any research, it's necessary to pick over the existing work and figure out how to progress with it, and this includes identifying what can be done better. Tandy seems to have been a genuinely curious, open-minded guy who had an interest in the paranormal, saw something cool, and that he thought was worth investigating, did what he could with the resources he had, and left us with a really fascinating premise to research further. But although he was a university lecturer, he didn't work for a psychology or parapsychology department, and he very likely didn't have the resources, equipment, or staff to do full-scale investigations into the subject. He acknowledges some of the shortcomings of his investigations in his own reports. Very sadly, he passed away unexpectedly in 2005, so unfortunately, he just never got the opportunity to further his research. So we had a look at an experiment with infrasound and EMF undertaken by a university psychology department to see what kind of results were gained from a scaled-up study, and see if they got any further with the burning question, can infrasound make you see ghosts? The paper we looked at was a study called the Haunt Project, undertaken in 2009 by a team from the Anomalistic Psychology Research Department at Goldsmiths College, London. If you've watched a lot of UK paranormal TV over the years, as we have, you might recognise the first name on this paper, which is that of Chris French, who has appeared on many UK TV shows relating to the paranormal, and on the BBC podcast Uncanny. In this study, the researchers took Tandy's theory on infrasound and other researchers' theories on EMF and used the two together in an attempt to create an artificially haunted room. Why did they decide to add EMF or electromagnetic fields into the mix? Well, we've all seen ghost hunters waving around EMF meters on TV. We even have one ourselves. And we've probably all heard people on TV talk about how things like unshielded electrical cables can lead to high levels of EMF. But EMF comes naturally from organic sources as well, as the paper details, including the natural variability in the Earth's magnetic field, movements of tectonic plates against each other, local geological factors such as quartz-based rock, and magnetic mineral properties. We've also been hearing from TV ghost hunters for years that high levels of EMF are associated with paranormal activity. There are various hypotheses flying around. Some reckon that high levels of EMF can create an environment which is conducive to paranormal activity, essentially making it easier for ghostly phenomena to manifest. Others think that it might affect our human bodies in a way that makes it easier for us to see ghosts. But the main hypothesis, that's been quoted for years now, is that the effect of EMF on the human body can cause us to experience sensations that seem paranormal in nature, but are in fact simply caused by the EMF fields causing odd symptoms in our bodies, much like Tandy's hypothesis around infrasound. In fact, many ghost hunters talk about this hypothesis as though it's been proven true, but it seems that the case for EMF debunking paranormal claims may not be quite so clear-cut after all. However, Chris and his colleagues thought that there was sufficient interest in the theories of EMF and infrasound causing haunting-type events to warrant an investigation of both. To do this, the team built a completely empty white circular room using canvas on a wooden frame, and asked 79 participants to spend 50 minutes in the room while the team pumped either infrasound, EMF, a combination of the two, or as a control, nothing at all, into the room. The infrasound waveform used was generated by combining two sine waves at 22.3 Hz and 18.9 Hz, Tandy's magic number, the ghost frequency. The EMF they used was calculated using experiments previously undertaken by neuroscientist Michael Persinger and colleagues, Persinger being one of the scientists involved in the development of the God helmet, which you might have heard of in paranormal fields. If you haven't, well, that's a whole other topic, and one that we definitely don't have time to get into today, because you could certainly go down a whole other rabbit hole with that research. But back to the Haunt Project, and I'll read you the abstract of the project's report. Recent research has suggested that a number of environmental factors may be associated with a tendency for susceptible individuals to report mildly anomalous sensations typically associated with haunted locations, including a sense of presence, feeling dizzy, inexplicable smells, and so on. Factors that may be associated with such sensations include fluctuations in the electromagnetic field, EMF, and the presence of infrasound.
The participants of the study were warned that they might experience anomalous sensations during their time in the room, and were asked to record any such experiences with a description, note of time, and a location on a floor plan of the room. The floor plan was important because, unbeknownst to the participants, the EMF would be strongest in one quadrant of the chamber, whilst the participants themselves were able to move around all quadrants freely. Once they had completed their session, they were asked to fill out 3 exit questionnaires. And that part's quite important too, because sometimes studies like this ask participants to fill out such questionnaires beforehand instead of on exit. And often, as in this case, some of these questions relate to the participants' belief in the paranormal, to assess whether they are likely to be suggestible to the idea of paranormal events. And of course, if you're questioned on your belief in the paranormal right before you enter an experiment where you are warned you might experience anomalous feelings, that could definitely plant the seed in your mind that the study might have something to do with the paranormal and could colour your experiences. So, French and his team were very careful to ensure there were no such hints prior to the participants entering the chamber. So, what were the results? Did the combination of infrasound and EMF make any of the participants see ghosts? Well, the short answer is no, but I'll read you the paper's conclusion. Many of the participants in this experiment reported experiencing mildly anomalous sensations. To this extent, we can indeed claim some success in building a haunted room. It is possible that the experimental setup used in this study, a quiet, round, cool, dimly lit, featureless white room, may have constituted a form of mild perceptual deprivation that was sufficient to induce a hallucinatory altered state of consciousness in some participants. Although the setup differed in significant ways from that used in Gansfield studies, the work of Wackerman et al. 2008 may be of relevance here. However, the degree to which those anomalous sensations were reported was unrelated to the experimental conditions employed. Given that all participants were informed in advance that they might experience unusual sensations whilst in the chamber, in line with the ethical requirements of informed consent, the most parsimonious explanation of our findings is in terms of suggestibility. Such an explanation is supported by the fact that the TLS scores, one of the exit questionnaires, known to correlate with suggestibility, significantly predicted both the total number of anomalous experiences reported on the floor plan and the scores on the exit scale. We feel that the data collected cast some light upon the psychology of hauntings. A considerable proportion of the participants reported a number of anomalous sensations in response to a fairly mild suggestion that in our white, round, featureless room, they might feel some unusual sensations. Our findings also failed to provide any support for the postulated link between the presence of infrasound and the experiencing of anomalous sensations. It is possible that such effects may be found under different conditions to those employed in the present study. Although the results reported do not support the idea that complex EMFs play a role in inducing anomalous experiences, the limitations of the current experimental setup must be acknowledged. The decision to allow participants to wander around freely within the experimental space in the interests of ecological validity meant that the amount of time they spent in those areas of the room affected by the complex EMF was not under experimental control. However, there was no evidence that more unusual sensations were reported when participants were in the quadrant most affected by EMF compared to the others. So let's just go back to that Gansfield reference in that quote for a minute. We've talked about the Gansfield experiment on this show before, and you might have seen it being used on paranormal shows. It's essentially a sensory deprivation technique where ping pong balls are used to cover a person's eyes and they listen to white noise through noise-cancelling headphones, essentially depriving their senses of ordinary input. It had been found that when deprived of normal sensory input, our brains can try and fill in the gaps by actually creating input that isn't there, and can even lead to hallucinations. What French and his team did with their plain, white, empty, circular, quiet, cool room was to perhaps unintentionally create a kind of sensory deprivation chamber, which could have been responsible for a number of the anomalous experiences reported by participants. In fact, for all we know, it could have been responsible for all of them. But that aside, it seems clear that the researchers didn't find any clear link between the reported anomalous experiences and the presence of either infrasound or EMF. Now, with regards to the infrasound, this could potentially be due to the level they were producing. Prior to the experiment, they did some tests to see at what level infrasound could be felt. Because above a certain level, even though you can't hear the sound, you can feel it. Not in the sense of unease or a fight or flight response as we've been talking about, but you can feel the pressure of the waves moving through the air, rather like when you can feel the low thrum of the blades of a far-off, low-flying helicopter. And they didn't want the participants to have any cues to let them know whether the infrasound was on or off when it was their turn in the chamber. These pilot tests established that no one could perceive the infrasound when it was played below 75 decibels. So that's the level they used for the experiment, which is rather lower than the levels of 80 to 95 decibels recorded by Tandy on the London Underground. So maybe the levels just weren't high enough to produce the desired effect. On the other hand, though, the levels were much higher than the 38 decibels recorded in the medieval Undercroft in Coventry. The exit questionnaires did show that many participants felt sensations we could easily equate with a paranormal experience. Feelings of dizziness, sadness, terror, hearing a ticking sound, and even experiencing odd smells. But some reported more ambiguous sensations, such as remembering images from recent dreams, a spinning sensation, pleasant vibrations, and recurrent ideas, none of which really scream paranormal experience. And more to the point, none of them seem to clearly tally with the use of either infrasound or EMF, and nobody reported seeing grey figures moving in the periphery of their vision or women's faces peering over their shoulders. So, has this disproved Tandy's theory about infrasound then? Not to mention all the many theories about EMF and the paranormal. Well, no, not really. This was just one limited investigation, granted, a much more in-depth one than Tandy's original investigations, but limited nonetheless. The fact is that all the studies we've looked at today are limited in one way or another, and to understand why none of these investigations have really been conclusive, we need to have a more in-depth look at some of those limitations.
The Haunt Project report notes a particular issue with Tandy's experiments, and some of the studies on EMF in which EMF levels have been monitored at reputedly haunted locations. They point out that one major problem with these experiments was that none of these investigations had taken any recordings of either EMF or infrasound levels at reputedly non-haunted locations at the same time that they were recording levels at the reputedly haunted ones. So it could very well be, in the case of Tandy's experiments in the medieval cellar, for example, that other buildings within the same vicinity might have also been experiencing the high levels of infrasound that they recorded. There could have been a peak of 19 Hz at the Tourist Information Centre, or the Museum and Art Gallery, or even the university buildings at the same time, especially given that they couldn't figure out what the source of the sound was. And yet none of these places were experiencing reports of strange sensations like the cellar was. Of course, it could also be the case that the infrasound was present only in the basement, but without taking those parallel readings, we'll never know. The problem is, and probably the reason Tandy didn't do this in the first place, is that of course that would require more equipment, more research staff, access to multiple buildings at the same time, not an easy thing to organise, and a massive and probably costly undertaking. Another issue in Tandy's research is that Tandy never actually measured any infrasound in his lab with recording equipment. His whole premise was based on one calculation using the size of the room. But worse than that, according to people who are much cleverer than us and know all about calculating acoustic resonance, he did the calculation wrong, because he only used the length of the room, and to accurately calculate the acoustic properties of a space, you would need to use all 3 dimensions of the room. And not only did Tandy not do this, he didn't record the dimensions of the room either, so no future investigators could test his idea out using the correct calculation. Now, we do not have PhDs in acoustics, and it turns out acoustics are really complicated, so we are leaning heavily on the research of Stephen T. Parsons here in his article Infrasound and the Paranormal for the Journal of the SPR, which we'll link in the show notes. Another point that Parsons brings up in his critique is that what Tandy described as a standing wave probably wasn't. Tandy described that the vibration of the foil became greatest in the centre of the room, but Parsons argues that with all types of standing wave, the maximum pressure, which would then cause the highest vibration, always occurs along the walls of the room. In fact, the whole concept of standing waves is way more complicated than we've discussed here, and if you want to know more about that, I recommend you read Parsons' paper, as we don't have the expertise to explain it adequately. So, although we know that turning the fan off caused the blade to stop vibrating, we don't really know that the fan was actually producing true infrasound at all. The last thing I want to touch on from Parsons' work is that he actually got the opportunity to visit the medieval Undercroft in Coventry for himself, just before the Tourist Information Centre closed in 2006. Parsons was able to take a series of measurements in the cellar, and he did find infrasound at a range of frequencies, but not Tandy's 19 Hz standing wave, although apparently infrasound is a notoriously difficult thing to measure, which I'm not going to get into here as I'm sure your brains are already melting, but we will of course provide you the resources to look into this further should you desire. And otherwise, we'll just take Parsons' word that the two investigations are actually quite hard to compare, and were of course 6 years apart, so something we're not even aware of could have changed in that time to alter the measurements. Or it could be down to how Tandy took his measurements, which problematically we don't know, as he didn't record the whole process that he used.
From a personal point of view, I wish Tandy had given more background on reports of the haunting. And this comes back to one of the main reasons we actually started this show in the first place, and that's that listening to people's personal experiences is important and should never be glossed over in favour of tech or gadgets. They are a crucial part of the whole picture, and this case is a really great demonstration of this. In his 1998 article, Tandy mentions that other staff members had strange experiences in the lab, and later he mentions that a new extractor fan had recently been installed, which he thought was causing the infrasound. But he never addresses whether the staff had experienced unexplained activity before the fan was installed, or if it was only after it was installed. This is really a massive oversight, because if the lab staff had been seeing grey figures wafting around before the fan was even present in the building, it immediately blows Tandy's whole idea out of the water. And lastly, we have to talk about eyeballs, because Tandy's whole theory about infrasound causing people to see apparitions kind of hinged on the premise of the low frequencies causing the eyeballs of witnesses to vibrate. And this is what got so many people in the paranormal world excited. Could infrasound have caused the grey figures seen in Tandy's lab? Well, we haven't been able to find any evidence that this is likely or even plausible. Pretty much every study into infrasound after Tandy's addresses this, many of them having gone back to the original research that Tandy used as well as their own experimental findings, and unless we've missed something, it seems to be almost universally agreed that it's not tenable that infrasound could cause complex visual hallucinations such as that which Tandy and the cleaner saw at the lab. At worst, infrasound could give a person blurry or smeared vision across the whole eyeball, but not in their distinct left periphery as described by Tandy, and no one can come up with any reasonable way that it could create the form of a grey figure that moved like a person. The levels of infrasound present would have to be super high to create even the blurred vision effect, much higher than the 38 decibels recorded in the cellar in Coventry. Again, there's a lot more really good and very complicated reasoning as to why Tandy's grey figure was incredibly unlikely to have been caused by infrasound, but we'll link to all the studies that can explain them better than we can. So, sorry Vic Tandy, but as much as I admire your curiosity and enthusiasm and out-of-the-box thinking, I do suspect that there's at least a chance that your lab may have been haunted after all.
We've almost reached the end, but before we wrap up, we would be remiss if we didn't talk briefly about horror movies. Because in the last couple of decades, there have been quite a few horror movies that have claimed to use infrasound in their films to make the audience feel extra creeped out, including Paranormal Activity and The Conjuring, amongst others. Now, I did a bit of a deep dive on this.
You did, didn't you? And it was very interesting, and Fitz tried very gallantly to explain a lot of the more technical aspects to me, bearing in mind that he's an audio engineer, and I'm afraid a lot of it went over. I tried really hard, but it's kind of brain melty.
Yeah, so in short, it would definitely depend on where you saw the films.
It would depend on the cinema.
And I'm not convinced that any of them are really capable of producing infrasound to any great extent.
No.
Now, you see, basically, infrasound is really hard to make.
Mm-hmm.
It takes a big speaker cone, it takes a lot of energy, and most modern speakers are designed to cut sound off, like roll it off really quickly before 20 hertz. And if you don't, in some cases, that can make your speakers short out or set on fire.
Yeah.
So it's generally
something they really want to avoid.
Yeah. And basically, like, they don't want to invest energy and time and money into making a speaker that nobody can hear.
No, and one that might explode.
Yes, and one that might combust. So speakers are not only not designed to produce this sound, most of them are tuned not to.
Mm-hmm.
If you've got a set of speakers at home, take a look, and I imagine you probably find that there's like a hole.
Like a little slot at the bottom.
Yeah, they can be a hole or a slot or a notch. But basically, it's sort of a hole in your speaker that doesn't have an actual speaker in it. And that is tuned to reduce infrasound.
It's just mind-blowing, because we've had speakers for years, and I've never even stopped to wonder what the slot was for.
Yeah, that's kind of an oversimplification. It's to enhance bass, but bass you can hear. And that means rolling off sound that isn't bass you can hear.
Yeah.
So it reduces infrasound in your speakers, and most of them aren't capable of producing infrasound, certainly not at a level that you could really sense. If you're very lucky, you've probably got some headphones that might be able to. Like, I have studio reference speakers. They're very expensive. They're very good. But even they can't really produce infrasound.
No, the only thing that you've got headphones, because you've got technical headphones, they can just play infrasound.
Yeah, I have some like studio quality headphones, and they can just allow you to produce infrasound. But most commercial speakers, well, I would say almost all commercial speakers can't. Most headphones probably can't.
And it's just not something that cinemas would want as an aspect of their speakers.
No, well, I spent a long time looking at spec sheets for cinema speakers.
I tried.
The amount of time I've spent in the last few weeks looking at the technical specifications of studio speakers and going back as far as I could find, because obviously some of the films that claim to have this are quite old as well. And almost none of them are capable of producing infrasound.
No.
What it seems to take to create infrasound is a special type of speaker. There are some that are like a traditional speaker, but they're huge. They take a huge amount of energy. And again, like, most cinemas won't bother to invest in them.
No.
Some places have vibrators in the seats.
Yeah, I was gonna ask about that, because didn't you find that some cinemas had basically tried to fake infrasound?
They've tried to fake it by making the seats vibrate and rumble. So that you think that it's the sound that's doing it, but it's not.
And it would be unsettling.
It's a mechanical vibration instead. So I don't think there's many, if any, theatres that would be able to produce infrasound.
That doesn't mean, however, that they're not using very low frequency sound. I mean, we've seen Paranormal Activity, and there is like this low rumble.
There's that low rumble.
And
That's kind of, it is kind of creepy. Like, sound definitely has a massive impact on like mood and experience.
Yeah.
So, like a low rumble, it is kind of creepy.
And it's, again, we went down so many rabbit holes trying to research this episode, but one of the things that came up with that low rumble is that it can trigger your fight or flight response because if you think about a lion, like the rumbling roar of a lion or the noise of an elephant, like dangerous animal survival kind of sounds.
Yeah. So, yeah, there's something to it. Definitely low rumbly sounds they do set us on edge a little bit. Now, what do you need to make infrasound? If you wanted to make infrasound, how do you do it? Well, it turns out the easiest way to do it is with what's called a rotary infrasound speaker. And if you catch the word rotary, can you imagine? Can you imagine what that is? They're basically a fan.
Yeah.
It's a fan driven by a speaker coil, but it's still basically just a fan that spins and the angle of the blades adjusts the frequency. But it's basically just a big fan.
Yeah. So Vic Tandy, with his extractor fan idea, he was definitely onto something. I mean, we're not saying he didn't know what he was talking about. Like, that could so easily have been the source of infrasound, but we just don't know that's what it was.
I'd be willing to, throw a tenner in the pot that it was.
Yeah.
But yeah,
whether that was creating grey, ethereal figures wafting around a lab is a completely different kettle of fish.
Well, I looked into this as well because I looked into the NASA studies that he was talking about. Oh,
did you actually read the NASA studies? Well, you did more. I didn't, I have to admit.
The levels of infrasound that were required to produce that weren't possible when the person wasn't basically touching what was creating the infrasound.
Oh, so you had to have really close proximity. You couldn't beam it over
distance. They literally had to strap a speaker to their heads, to like the thing that was vibrating to their heads to make them sense it.
And I suspect it's similar with EMF because when we mentioned earlier, there's been this kind of idea bandied around like for years on paranormal shows, and it's been done to death that like, oh, well, we've got high EMF in here and that can make you hallucinate. And like, I'm not saying that it can't. I'm sure, to be fair, we didn't go that far down the EMF rabbit hole this time. And there probably are studies out there that have proved that. But again, it's likely to be at much higher levels than the kind of thing we're experiencing in everyday situations.
So, yeah, it's a tricky one. But I also found what's called an experiment called Sounds in Silence, where they did use infrasound. Basically, what happened was they had a concert, and the people that went to the concert were played infrasound or not, and were asked to review their feelings about the concert. They knew it was an experiment, but they didn't know what it was about.
So was this with music or just silence?
With music.
With music, okay. So sometimes they'd be hearing music without infrasound, and sometimes they'd be hearing the music and there was infrasound underneath.
Yes,
okay.
Basically. And they wanted to see if the infrasound made people like freaked out and scared. It did have an effect, but it wasn't necessarily the effect that you might be expecting.
So it wasn't necessarily spooky?
No. It turns out that what it seemed to do was enhance the feeling that they were having at the time. So the people that were enjoying the concert enjoyed it more. The people that weren't enjoying the concert enjoyed it less.
Do you know what's so weird? I've just realised that this is exactly what we were talking about earlier with our stories and how the context of your reference point and your experience and your personal history with something colours the way you interpret something as being spooky or being pleasant. It's just come full circle again.
It has. It definitely has. And there was something else I found that was really interesting. That was amusing. Like, I've kind of I spoiled the pudding a bit there by giving the Sounds in Silence first, because I also came across a Mythbusters episode where they tested infrasound, because the same thing. They wanted to see if infrasound in horror films scared people, freaked them out. So what they did was they took a group of people to an abandoned holiday park.
Ooh, creepy.
And there was just a row of like 10 identical cabins. And in one of them, they were playing infrasound.
Right.
And in the others, they weren't.
And they didn't know which one it was.
And the people didn't know which one it was. So they basically assigned people to go to each building and sit for an hour and then tell them what they thought.
So they sent them off to do what we do sometimes on our paranormal postcard trips and get their spidey senses in gear and try and figure out where the path of weird is.
Indeed. And they didn't find it.
Oh, oh no.
So they basically asked them which was the spookiest house
Yeah.
that they were in. And almost none of them picked the one with the infrasound.
Oh,
Most of them picked one of the other buildings.
well, that is very interesting on a different level.
Yeah.
So there was a majority
Mhm.
of opinion of which the spookiest building was.
Yes.
And it was not the one with the infrasound, but it
not the one
was a
with the
particular.
infrasound.
So that raises an entirely different question then. So what's causing that? Is it something paranormal?
Who knows?
Oh, I love that. I love it.
But yeah, I do love Mythbusters. And when I was searching it and it came up Mythbusters, look into infrasound, I was like, yes! Excellent. But yeah, it was just interesting that it didn't seem to have any effect on how spooky they found it. And doubling up with the Sounds in Silence experiment, where it didn't seem to make them feel spooky, I'm kind of leaning towards, it doesn't really do anything.
I mean, I think it depends on a lot of factors. Like I say, the level of infrasound is really important, and I think the level of EMF is probably really important as well. The proximity to the source of infrasound or EMF, I'm sure, is very important. But I think also the sensitivity of the person.
Yeah.
Like the same with hearing. I mean, I can hear sounds that you can't hear. You can hear some sounds that I can't hear. I've been to too many rock concerts.
Because I think I can actually hear some infrasound because we tried this at home.
Yeah.
I generated an infrasound signal
Don't
in
do
my
this
headphones.
at home, kids. Don't know if it's safe. Don't recommend it.
And Lil couldn't hear it, but I could.
Yeah.
So there's different people's susceptibility to it. And when I said a minute ago, I don't think there's anything to it, I think that was specifically in relation to films.
Yes.
That wasn't in relation to necessarily the paranormal.
No.
Because now the fact that it doesn't necessarily seem to make you freaked out, unless potentially you were already a bit freaked out and it just enhanced that.
Mm-hmm. But it is being found present at haunted locations.
It is potentially being found at haunted locations.
So
Again,
there's some
it's not being tested at all of them, so we're going to have to see if we can find a way of listening out for it at other haunted locations. But it makes me wonder whether it is part of a web of things that are required.
The perfect storm that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, you've all heard of the stone tape theory, I'm sure, where the physical surroundings have potentially recorded something that's happened in history.
A bit like a tape player.
A bit like a tape player. Is infrasound part of the play button?
Yeah.
Like, does it take infrasound and a recording and a certain level of EMF and a certain level of humidity and a certain temperature
and a certain person?
Yeah.
What about a certain body mass? I mean, okay, so just for now, let's just say skeptic hats into the wind, everybody.
I chucked mine away before I started talking on this one.
We have been very scientific all episode. Our brains have melted. It's time for a little bit of indulgence now. This is not scientific at all. We're going to have some lovely wild speculation for a bit. What about the person themselves? Because I often think about like the resonance being tuning yourself into a radio station. Mm-hmm. And I mean, we've thought about that with our radio experiment, for example. I mean, we're literally trying to tune an actual radio to hear the voices of ghosts, and it has worked on occasion. So with infrasound being potentially high in places that are reputedly haunted, is the infrasound tuning the person into a different frequency? Mm-hmm. And then it would make sense that it doesn't work on everybody because everybody has a different body shape and mass and therefore a different resonant frequency to a certain extent. You're not all going to vibrate at the same speed.
This has just raised something else that I came across while I was researching, and it's just made it feel a little bit more important. And again, potentially about the stone tape theory and being a play button. And it also kind of goes back to the Ghost of the Underground when they were talking about how infrasound couldn't open doors.
Yeah.
And when I was researching this, I came across a guy who was building a rotary
basically a speaker with a fan in it, essentially.
Yeah, basically an infrasound fan speaker. And what was happening in the room as he was using it, like he could generate tones at specific frequencies. And this was affecting things in the room, like it was making the curtains, because it shifts a lot of air.
Yeah.
Like the lower the frequency, the longer the wavelength, the more air it's shifting. So it was making the curtains move. It was making his door open and close and rattle.
So when I said infrasound can't open doors, it actually can.
Potentially,
Although
it
probably
could.
probably not train carriage doors in a particular sequence.
Yeah, well,
this is
it. You've got to remember that it's a wavelength. So it's basically
it's backwards and forwards.
So it was making the door rattle.
Yes.
Not like open wide and stay open. It was just open, close, open, close. And the frequency would adjust how quickly it did that.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that's the thing that's when you're like, oh, there's nothing I can think of that could mean making that door rattle.
Yeah,
maybe
it could
it's
be
infrasound.
Yeah.
But conversely, could that be the trigger for releasing the recording on Stone Tape Theory or something? Could the right frequency... Oh, man, I sound like somebody that's proper off in woo-woo land, but if it's the right frequency, does it release the...
We've done our due diligence with the science, and we are stating outright, this is not science.
And conversely, if I wanted to be super skeptic, like, does the frequency vibrate something in your brain, like the visual cortex of your brain to see something? Or...
Well, no, I think this is where Tandy was going with the whole eyeball theory, and there was a lot more complex information to that we haven't covered here because it's too much, it's too complicated, and I only kind of understand it. But basically, they know what is necessary for your brain to essentially create a complex visual hallucination.
It's going to be too
and it's difficult,
vague, isn't it?
Yeah, it's vibration alone.
It's going to make your whole brain vibrate rather than a specific portion.
So I think that's very unlikely. But the other thing to bear in mind about when people sort of debunk paranormal activity with using infrasound, it's not only from the perspective of the eyeball vibrating theory, for example. A lot of times you'll hear people saying things like, because we do know that infrasound can make you feel unsettled, it can make you feel on edge and uneasy. And then people jump from that to saying, well, yes, you saw an apparition, but your brain probably just filled in the blanks, or you hallucinated, or, it's like we were talking about with the Gansfield experiment. With a certain lack of sensory input, your brain can kind of try and fill in the blanks. So people will say, well, you probably just saw a shadow. And because you were already on edge because of the infrasound, it was scary and you interpreted it as a ghost. Mm-hmm. That kind of thing. And while that's not wrong, I always like to look at it as, well, how about if you flipped that on its head? Because our fight or flight reaction exists for a very good reason. It keeps us alive in dangerous situations. If you go back to the idea of, like we were talking about earlier, the sounds, the rumbling sounds of a lion roaring, or the sound of like the rumbly sound of an elephant approaching or something like that, that is a danger signal to your brain. And then the fight or flight reaction happens to put all your senses on alert and flood your system with adrenaline. So you're suddenly hyper aware of all your surroundings and everything that's going on. Senses that when we're just bimbling around are quite dull. And we're actually, as human beings, not very good at noticing what's going on around us because we tend to operate on sort of autopilot a lot of the time. But when we get this fight or flight, we're suddenly hyper aware of many, many things that we wouldn't normally be aware of. So what if it's not the fact that being scared is making you interpret things wrongly? What if being scared is just making you tap into senses that are normally shut off?
Mm-hmm. That's true. I've got another angle that's almost a reflection of that as well. And something that might make you think twice about ever getting on a bus again.
Oh, Lord.
Apparently, I came across a study where they were, because obviously infrasound is created by a lot of things, including machinery, and it's quite common in buses, apparently.
Yes.
Now, there was a study done on bus drivers, and they basically had their brain waves measured when they were driving their bus, and the levels of infrasound measured, blah, 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 blah. Turns out, it seems like infrasound can put your brain into a partial sleep state.
Okay, well, we
even
know
whilst
that,
you're conscious.
yeah, sound can, like, was it, what's the kind of sound that can alter, you can listen to it on YouTube, binaural beats that can alter your brainwave state.
Yeah, and basically it made them feel more sleepy, but it was literally more than that. Their brainwaves were actually going into a sleep state.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
That's quite dangerous.
They were still awake, but they were showing similar signs of people being asleep. So do you have a kind of like waking sleep paralysis effect in some cases?
I don't know.
But yeah, it concerns me about ever getting on a bus ever again.
But presumably with electric buses these days, that's not going to be so much of a problem.
Yeah, maybe. So go electric people.
Buses.
Anyway, I think we may have discussed the topic. We're going to start chasing our tails on this one in a minute.
Yeah, I mean, it is such a fascinating topic. And I know we've kind of gone round in circles at some point, but that, to be fair...
There's a lot we could share. Like, we both really dove really deep into this one.
And I think a lot of the researchers have done the same thing as we do. You know, the scientific researchers, the papers that we've read, people have kind of done the same thing. You do end up going round in circles in a way, because there's really no beginning and no end, and the scope is kind of limitless in a way. But it's such a fascinating topic. We'd really love to know what you think as well. We'd be really interested to know. Throw your skeptic hats to the wind, or come at it from a scientific point of view. If you have a better background in acoustics than we do, chuck your hat in the ring. But equally, if you want to throw skeptic hat to the wind and have a bit of fun, indulgent, wild speculation about how infrasound could tie into the paranormal and maybe cause us to see things, or maybe make it possible for things to manifest, just drop us a line. Comment in the group, comment on the YouTube video, wherever you can. I really want to hear your thoughts. It's so interesting.
Yeah. Does it make you see ghosts that aren't there? Does it let you see ghosts that are there?
Yeah.
Or does it not do anything? The jury is out.
Absolutely. Well, I think that is actually it from us today. We do hope you enjoyed this, even though it was a bit long and brain melty. And hopefully we'll make that road trip to Coventry very soon for the paranormal postcard we had originally intended to bring you today.
And that is all we have time for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you to everybody that shared their stories with us. And we are always in need of new stories. So if you've had a paranormal experience, please do get in touch with us at knockoncevs.com. Thank you so much to our Patreon and Coffee supporters. We couldn't do the show without you. And if you'd like to support the show, please do visit us at patreon.com/KOFY. And if you have a podcast and you'd like your audio production done for you, then I have my own audio production company. So drop me a line and I'm more than happy to help you with that. And we hope that you'll join us again next time for some more spooky stories and haunted history on the next Knock Once for Yes.